Picture this. You wake up and it is negative 30 degrees outside. Not the kind of cold where you layer up, scrape your windshield, and complain about it on the way to a heated car. The kind of cold where exposed skin begins to sustain frostbite damage within minutes. The kind of cold where the moisture in your breath freezes before it fully leaves your mouth. The kind of cold where any gap in your clothing, any patch of exposed skin at your wrist, your neck, your ankles, becomes a liability that your body will begin paying for immediately and in full. You have no central heating, no insulated walls, no synthetic thermal underlayer from a sports brand, no hot coffee waiting in a machine on the counter. What you have is a fire that needs to be kept alive through the night, a shelter made from materials you gathered and constructed yourself, clothing you produced by hand from animal skins using tools you also made by hand, and somewhere between 20 and 40 other people who are depending on the same set of solutions working correctly, every single day for the entire duration of a winter that will last 6 months. Oh, and outside your shelter, in the dark, there are cave lions, cave hyenas, woolly rhinoceroses, a landscape that is simultaneously beautiful and completely indifferent to whether you live or die. This is not a survival challenge. This is not a reality television competition with a prize at the end. This is Tuesday in the Ice Age, and the ancient humans living through it were not special in the sense of being superhuman. They were people, biologically essentially identical to you, with the same body, the same brain, the same basic vulnerabilities to cold, hunger, and predation. And they survived. Not barely, not accidentally, not by luck alone, but systematically, repeatedly, across tens of thousands of years, through some of the most extreme climate conditions our species has ever inhabited. So the question worth spending real time on is not whether they survived. The question is how. What did ancient humans actually do, think, build, wear, eat, and organize to make survival in the freezing ice age not just possible, but sustainable across generations? Because the answer is not simple, and it is not what most people expect. It involves technology more sophisticated than you probably imagine, social structures more complex than the popular image of cave-dwelling brutes suggests, and a relationship with the frozen landscape around them that was intimate, detailed, and accumulated over lifetimes of direct experience. Start with the cold itself, because understanding what ancient humans were actually dealing with requires calibrating the mental image most people carry. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, was not a single uniform deep freeze spread evenly across the planet. Ice sheets covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere, extending across what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and significant parts of northern Europe and Asia. But the areas where ancient humans actually lived in large numbers were not under those ice sheets. They lived in the unglaciated zones south of the ice front, the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, windy grassland that stretched across much of Eurasia and supported an astonishing density of large animal life. Temperatures in these zones during glacial maximum winters were brutal by any modern standard, regularly reaching -20 to -30 Celsius in the coldest periods, with wind chill pushing effective temperatures lower still. But they were survivable, and ancient humans had been surviving in cold environments for long enough before the glacial maximum that the adaptive toolkit they brought to the coldest periods was already well developed. The Ice Age did not catch ancient humans unprepared. It was, for many populations, the environment their ancestors had been refining survival strategies for across many thousands of years. The first and most foundational of those strategies was shelter, and this is where the popular image of Ice Age, people living in caves, needs significant revision. Because caves, while used when available and appropriately located, were not the primary shelter solution for most ancient groups across most of the Ice Age landscape. The Mammoth Steppe was largely open grassland with limited cave availability, and groups needed to follow animal migrations across wide territories. You cannot do that if your housing strategy depends on finding a cave exactly where you need to stop. The solution ancient humans developed was constructed shelter, portable or semi-permanent structures built from whatever materials the landscape provided. On the open steppe, the most significant building material was mammoth bone. Excavated sites in Eastern Europe and Russia, most famously at locations like Mezhyrich and Mezin in present-day Ukraine, have revealed the foundations of structures built from mammoth skulls, jawbones, shoulder blades, and long bones arranged in interlocking patterns to create walls and frameworks. These were not crude piles of bones. They were engineered structures, with heavier bones used as foundation elements, curved bones used to create arched or domed profiles, and smaller bones filling gaps in the structural frame. The frameworks were almost certainly covered with hides stretched over the bone structure and weighted or secured at the base, creating insulated enclosures that dramatically reduced the wind exposure and heat loss that made the open steppe lethal lethal in deep winter. The engineering knowledge required to build these structures was not intuitive. Selecting which bones worked best for which structural roles, understanding how to interlock curved elements to create stable arched forms, knowing how many hides were needed to cover a given frame, and how to secure them against wind. This was accumulated technical knowledge, passed down through generations of builders, refined through trial and error across many construction seasons. The people building mammoth bone shelters were not improvising. They were executing a known, practiced construction method that worked, and the evidence in the archaeological record suggests they returned to the same shelter sites repeatedly, rebuilding or reusing structures across multiple seasons. In forested regions where wood was available, ancient groups built timber-framed shelters, structural approaches that also required significant technical knowledge about selecting appropriate timber, managing green versus seasoned wood, and creating stable joinery without metal fasteners. Hide covering remained the primary insulating layer in most cases, with the quality and preparation of those hides being critical to the shelter's thermal performance. Now, here is the part that separates survivable shelter from actually warm shelter: the fire inside it. Fire management during the Ice Age was not simply a matter of keeping a flame burning. It was a technical discipline with its own knowledge base, its own material requirements, and its own set of practices that accumulated across generations. The fuel available on the open steppe was limited: woody scrub, dried grass, animal dung, and bone. Bone fuel is less intuitive than wood, but burns with significant heat once established, and ancient groups living in areas with abundant large animal remains appear to have relied on it heavily as a primary fuel source. Fat, rendered from animal carcasses and stored for multiple purposes, also burned effectively and provided concentrated heat output. Managing a fire in an enclosed hide shelter required balancing heat output against ventilation. Too much fire in a poorly ventilated space fills the interior with smoke and carbon monoxide. Too little fire, and the thermal advantage of the shelter collapses. Ancient builders appear to have understood this balance, positioning hearths relative to shelter openings and using structural features to create airflow that managed smoke without losing too much heat. This is not an obvious engineering solution. It is the product of learning, sometimes through painful and dangerous experience, what configurations worked and which ones did not. Beyond the structural and fire management dimensions of shelter, the thermal performance of ancient dwellings depended significantly on social density. 20 people sleeping in a mammoth bone and hide structure generate a substantial amount of body heat. That collective warmth was not incidental to the shelter's function. It was a core part of its thermal design. Ancient groups clustered together in winter not only for social and safety reasons, but because the combined metabolic heat of multiple bodies in an insulated space made a genuine and measurable difference to the interior temperature. The social structure of ancient winter camps was, in a very real sense, a heating system. Clothing deserves extended attention because it was, in many respects, the most critical technological achievement of Ice Age survival, the one that made everything else possible. A human being in the open air at negative 25 degrees Celsius without adequate clothing is dead within an hour or two. With adequate clothing, that same human can be productive and mobile for hours. The difference between those two outcomes is entirely dependent on the quality of the insulating layers between the person's skin and the outside air, which means the quality of Ice Age clothing was not an aesthetic or comfort consideration. It was a life and death calculation. Ancient clothing technology was far more sophisticated than most people appreciate. The presence of bone needles at Ice Age sites, needles fine enough to thread sinew no thicker than modern thread, indicates the production of tailored, fitted garments with multiple components and closed seams. This matters enormously because the thermal performance of clothing depends critically on fit. A garment with gaps at the wrists, ankles, or neck loses heat through convection at those gaps in ways that dramatically reduce its overall insulating effectiveness. Inuit clothing technology, which represents the most refined cold weather clothing system ever developed by any human culture, and which almost certainly builds on traditions stretching back into ancient times, achieves its extraordinary thermal performance through layering and fit. An inner layer worn with the fur against the skin, an outer layer worn with the fur facing outward, and careful tailoring that closes off convective pathways at every opening. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Ancient Ice Age groups appear to have operated with similar principles. The bone needles and awls found at sites across the Ice Age world indicate clothing construction that required precise piercing and stitching of hides, work that could not be accomplished with cruder tools and that produced garments with genuinely closed seams. The range of animal skins available to Ice Age people provided a spectrum of insulating properties: mammoth wool, horsehide, reindeer fur, Arctic fox, wolf, each with different thermal characteristics suited to different garment layers and different conditions. Hide preparation was a labor-intensive and technically demanding process that consumed enormous amounts of time, primarily performed by ancient women. A fresh animal hide is useless as clothing material. It is heavy, stiff, and will harden into an inflexible board as it dries. Converting it into supple, functional leather, or fur, required scraping away fat and tissue from the inner surface with stone or bone scrapers, stretching the hide repeatedly while wet, working it physically through extended cycles of pulling, folding, and kneading to break down the fiber structure, and treating it with materials like animal brain, which contains oils and enzymes that lubricate and soften the fibers to prevent stiffening. A single large hide processed to high quality required many hours of sustained physical effort. A complete winter wardrobe for one person required many hides. The implication of this is significant. Ancient women who produced clothing were not engaged in supplementary or secondary survival work. They were manufacturing the primary technology that kept people alive in the cold. Without their technical expertise and sustained labor, no amount of hunting skill or shelter construction knowledge would have been sufficient. Ice Age survival was a collective technological project, and clothing production was one of its most critical and demanding components. Food, in the context of Ice Age survival, operated on a fundamentally different logic than most modern people apply to eating. In extreme cold, the human body's caloric requirements escalate dramatically. Simply maintaining core body temperature in very cold conditions requires significant metabolic energy even at rest, and active people working outdoors in Ice Age winter conditions needed caloric intakes that would be considered extreme by modern sedentary standards. Fat, specifically, was the most valuable food category available, providing more than twice the caloric density of protein or carbohydrate per gram, and being preferentially used by the body for thermogenesis, the metabolic production of heat. Ancient hunters understood fat value in ways that are reflected directly in the archaeological evidence. Bone marrow extraction, accessing the fat-rich marrow inside large animal bones by cracking them with stone hammers, appears consistently at Ice Age sites, with the pattern of breakage clearly indicating deliberate extraction rather than incidental damage. The marrow of large Ice Age animals was extraordinarily rich in fat and calories. Skull cracking to access brain material, also high in fat, appears at some sites as well. Ancient hunters targeting large animals on the mammoth steppe were not simply pursuing protein. They were pursuing fat, and the selection of which body parts to prioritize in processing reflected a detailed understanding of fat distribution in different animal species. Storage was equally critical as acquisition. A successful large kill in autumn, a mammoth, a horse, multiple bison, provided more meat than a group could consume immediately, and that surplus needed to be preserved for the winter months when hunting was difficult and prey scarce. The Ice Age environment itself provided one preservation method: frozen ground, and cold temperatures preserved meat cached in pits or stored in cold locations for extended periods. Dried meat, strips of flesh hung in wind to lose moisture, provided another preserved form that was portable and storable. Rendered fat stored in bladders, stomachs, or hide containers remained stable in cold conditions and provided concentrated caloric reserves for the difficult months. Planning the annual resource calendar, knowing when to hunt which species, how much to store, where to cache reserves, and how to distribute stored food across the winter months required the kind of ecological knowledge and forward planning that accumulated over generations. A group that ate through its winter stores too quickly in early winter faced starvation in the months before spring prey became available again. Managing that resource curve correctly across multiple households across the full duration of an Ice Age winter required social coordination mechanisms and decision-making structures that extended well beyond individual self-interest. Social organization was, in fact, one of the most critical survival technologies ancient groups possessed, and one of the least visible in the popular imagination, which tends to focus on physical artifacts rather than social structures. Ice Age winter groups were not simply collections of individuals happening to occupy the same shelter, they were organized communities with differentiated roles, reciprocal obligations, collective resource management systems, and social norms that coordinated behavior in ways that made group survival possible. Sharing norms were fundamental. In an environment where individual hunting success was variable and unpredictable, where a group might have abundant food one week and very little the next, systems for distributing food across the group, regardless of who had produced it, created a form of collective insurance that smoothed out the volatility of individual fortune. A hunter who shared generously from a successful kill could expect the same from others when his own hunt failed. This reciprocity was not merely altruistic sentiment. It was a risk management strategy operating over a time horizon of months and years, and maintaining it required social enforcement mechanisms, reputation, obligation, the memory of who had given and who had taken, that were sophisticated and carefully maintained. Knowledge sharing operated on similar principles. The information held by different members of an Ice Age group, ecological knowledge about animal movements, technical knowledge about tool production and repair, medical knowledge about treating cold injuries and illness, was collectively more valuable than any individual's share of it. Creating conditions under which people shared that knowledge freely rather than hoarding it as individual advantage required social structures that rewarded sharing and discouraged monopolization of critical information. The oldest members of ancient groups were the repositories of the rarest and most valuable knowledge, the memories of previous crises and how they had been navigated. An elder who had survived a similar winter 40 years ago, who remembered where the group had found food when primary sources failed, who knew which alternative strategies had worked and which had made things worse, was a survival resource of the first order. The consistent presence of older individuals in Ice Age group structures was not accidental or sentimental. It was functional. Their knowledge was irreplaceable in exactly the situations where it was most needed. Psychological resilience was the dimension of Ice Age survival that no artifact can fully capture, but that was no less real for its invisibility in the archaeological record. 6 months of cold and darkness and confinement and food stress, repeated year after year, imposed psychological demands on ancient humans that were significant and real. The social and cultural practices that ancient groups maintained through winter, storytelling, music, the making of art, and personal ornaments, the performance of rituals that gave meaning and structure to the difficult season, were not luxuries or distractions from survival. They were maintenance of the psychological and social coherence that made survival possible. A group that fell apart under winter stress, that dissolved into conflict, hoarding, and mutual distrust, was a group that died. A group that maintained its social bonds, its shared identity, its collective commitment to mutual support through the worst months. That was a group with a genuine survival advantage. The cultural practices that maintained those bonds were as functionally important as the bone needles and the mammoth fat and the hide shelters. Ancient humans survived the freezing Ice Age because they were not dealing with it as individuals. They were dealing with it as groups equipped with accumulated technological knowledge, sophisticated social organization, detailed ecological understanding, and cultural practices that maintained the human capacity for cooperation under extreme stress. The cold was real. The danger was real. The hardship was real and unrelenting and sometimes fatal. But so was the knowledge. So was the skill. So was the social intelligence that turned a group of biologically unremarkable primates into a community capable of sustaining itself through conditions that would end most modern people within days. The Ice Age did not pause for ancient humans. It did not moderate itself out of consideration. It showed up every winter with everything it had. And ancient humans showed up back with everything they had figured out across thousands of years of hard experience. And here you are, descended from the ones who kept figuring it out, sitting somewhere warm, which is either a triumph of human ingenuity or a very comfortable irony, depending on how you look at it.